Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Pearl Harbor, 2,400 miles and 6 hours from the American mainland on the island of Oahu. On December 6, 1941, it is the home to the Pacific Fleet. 90 ships are anchored, 8 of these battleships. The USS Vega, an auxiliary cargo vessel, arrives on the afternoon of December 6th. The crew has sailed from the cold of the Aleutian Islands to the tropical paradise of Pearl Harbor. 21-year-old Dexter Ford is aboard the Vega.
We waited until a net stretched across the harbor entrance could be lowered. All live ammunition was ordered put below the deck before the ship was allowed to enter the harbor. The ship tied up at Port 14 near huge oil tanks and not far from Battleship Row. Pearl Harbor was real good duty. We ate at tables where we were served by a mess cook. Dexter Ford, 21 years old.
22-year-old Charles Lingafelter was assigned to the USS Nevada. He had sent a picture with a note home that was taken September 28, 1941.
Hawaii, Pearl Harbor in the background, and sugarcane field. The clothes that I work in aboard a ship. Shirt and dungarees. Charles Lingafelter, 22 years old.
A small Japanese boy, about 7 to 9 years of age, brought Christmas presents to the crew at 6 a.m. or earlier. We called him Nudie because of his habit of diving naked for coins. I became quite friendly with him. After the attack, it was decided that someone must have known something that I and the rest of the boat crew didn't. There was suspicion that the boy was being used by the Japanese as an unwitting spy. We never saw the boy again. Fireman First Class Lester Johnston, 18 years old.
My tug, the USS Grebe, was in port, and I was ashore pressing my Navy whites, preparing for a day of liberty in Honolulu. Seaman First Class, Richard Horton, 18 years old.
I was on special detail at the immigration station in downtown Honolulu. I was getting ready to work in the kitchen. Technician 5, William Brenner, 21 years old.
I was stationed at Camp Schofield on the island of Oahu and had just a month before I was to return home after serving 4 years in the Army. Sam Sawyer, 21, Army.
Also serving with the Army at Pearl Harbor was 17-year-old Ralph Harrington. What they didn't know was that a Japanese strike force of 353 Japanese fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes had been launched in 2 waves from 6 aircraft carriers that were stationed 230 miles north of the island of Oahu. The first wave struck the base at 7:55 a.m.
I heard the sound of an airplane, and some guy said, if he doesn't pull up, he's going to clobber. Then came the big explosion, and we all swarmed out into the yard. We looked across Wheeler Field, and there was a lot of thick smoke. Then suddenly it was wall-to-wall planes. The first response was shock. We wondered, what kind of maneuvers was this? Then the sergeant said, "Oh my God, those are Japs." Me and the others in Hawaiian Pack Train Unit broke out rifles and began shooting at the Japanese planes. Sergeant John Hubert.
I was in bed as Sunday was the only day we were allowed to sleep in. Most of the fellows in the barracks had gone to breakfast, and about 3 or 4 of us were left. We heard the first shots and thought it was men at the rifle range practicing. Someone remarked it was a bad time for anyone to be practicing. About that time, a shell came through the barracks wall and passed about 8 inches from my foot. I was sitting down getting my shoes on. I picked up the shell and burned my fingers on it, which was the only injury I received during the whole attack. We ran from the barracks and saw 2 planes make 2 or 3 more passes at us. They were shooting at water tanks a short distance away, which they thought were fuel tanks. Our barracks, Schofield Barracks, was up the hill from the harbor and right across the road from Wheeler Field, which was totally destroyed. When we realized that the planes were Japanese, we went inside for our clothes and guns. Our guns were locked up, so we broke the rifle racks and broke into the ammunition room to get shells. The new M1 rifles had just been issued and no one knew how to use them, but it was all we had. Everything was fire. It seemed like there wasn't anything that wasn't on fire. Robert Anderson, 34th Engineers, 23 years old.
When general quarters were called that morning, I was below deck talking to a laundryman. It took about a minute to realize what was going on. At first I thought it was just another drill, but I felt a little shudder. I immediately thought, this is no drill, something is happening. We got topside right now. I saw them bombing Hickman Field nearby. The first thing I saw was 3 big balls of fire, and the next thing, incendiary bombs falling. I didn't have time to think of anything. I was a gunner on the ship, serving as a loader, and the captain of my gun was standing there watching the bombs drop. I had to push him out of the way to get to the gun, and then he joined in. We were using a 3-inch gun, which was effective. We got pretty close to them. I think we disconcerted them enough. The ship's deck guns, however, were ineffective against the aircraft. The enemy planes made about 3 passes in groups of 5 over our ship, trying to hit huge oil tanks nearby. The oil tanks stored fuel sufficient to serve the entire Pacific Fleet and aircraft. The end of the dock was blown off, and the ship shuddered several times. They failed to hit the tanks. Had they hit the tanks, I wouldn't be here to tell about it. There were several near misses by bombs aimed at those oil tanks. If any of the bombs had hit the tanks, the entire harbor would have been set afire. Dexter Ford.
Me and some other sailors rushed outside to see the enemy zooming overhead. About 30 of us got in big bunches with 30-30 rifles and shot at them as they came over. The Zeros, Vals, and Kates may not have been hit, but it was something to keep our minds off everything else. Seaman First Class Richard Horton.
I was far from the harbor, but not the terror. A bomb fell right in our yard. Technician 5, William Brenner.
I was standing in the yard watching the planes bomb Pearl Harbor. One turned so low while bombing the waterworks that you could see him smile. It was difficult to realize what was going on because the attack caught everybody off guard. Sam Sawyer.
I was lying in my bunk listening to the song, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. My eagerness to see the enemy almost got me killed. Me and 4 other crewmen on the captain's gig we served on were quickly off the ship and on the docks at Pearl City, across the harbor from Hickman Field and Wheeler Fields, and near where the USS Curtis was docked. My boss tackled me and yelled, "Get down, you fool, them are Japs." I said, "What are Japs?" I didn't know what Japs were. We didn't have live ammunition when the attack began. It was locked up while the officers were on shore for liberty. The USS Curtis was moored close by on the east of the Pearl City docks. A Japanese plane was hit by anti-aircraft shells and lost a wing in the air, but the pilot maneuvered the plane and crashed it onto the Curtis decks, starting a fire and preventing the ship from leaving its moorings. Many sailors in white who were going to or coming back from liberty were killed and wounded. Fireman First Class Lester Johnston.
As the first wave of Japanese planes flew off, a second wave of Japanese planes attacked.
The planes came in 2 waves. Each attack lasted about 20 minutes. I watched the USS Utah and the USS Oklahoma roll over and sink on the north side of Ford Island behind my boat. I remember the USS Nevada putting up a fight before it sank with the 14-inch main battery remaining just above the water level. The Japanese pilots knew exactly what ships they were to bomb and exactly where the ships were. They sank 6 battleships and shot up 164 planes on the ground. Fireman First Class Lester Johnston.
On board the USS Oklahoma was 21-year-old Maida Wilson Fellumley, Jr. of West Locust Street.
I was at my battle station below decks and felt the first of 3 torpedoes hit the ship. I tried to escape through a porthole, but the Japs were strafing. Many boys were trying to escape over the side of the boat. I was finally able to get through the porthole and was picked up by a small boat and taken to shore. I was black with oil from head to toe. Maida Wilson Felmley, Jr., 21 years old.
The Nevada was anchored at the end of Battleship Row, with the bulk of the USS Arizona blocking her ahead and the USS Vestal lying alongside the Arizona. The Nevada was trapped between ship and shoal. 4 men from Newark were on board the Nevada: 19-year-old Ernest Crothers of Mount Vernon Road, 24-year-old Edward Lingafelter, Route 2, 20-year-old Frederick Marin, Route 1, and 18-year-old Benton Moore, South 5th Street. The Nevada had taken 1 torpedo from before the Vestal was moved, and even then it was a single feat of seamanship that she was maneuvered from her narrow berth and past the Arizona, which was now in flames without disaster. Frederick Marin was a fire controller on the Nevada and had just been relieved.
I heard machine gun fire and went to the galley to see what was up. I saw another ship afire. The planes were coming in and dropping bombs and torpedoes. I couldn't believe we were under attack. First thing I did was go to my battle station. It was on the main battery with the 14-inch guns. They were no good. We couldn't use them against the planes because they were right on us. So I went to the second loader on the 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. Eventually, we ran out of ammunition, so the gun captain sent me and another guy down below to an ammunition hoist to bring up more ammunition. The cooks were supposed to man the hoist, but they never showed up. I don't know where they were. I had just loaded the first round in the hoist, pushed the button, and a bomb came down through the laundry room and went off. The guy that came down with me was killed. He was standing in the doorway. It blew me against the outward bulkhead. When I came to, my skivvy shirt was on fire. I tore it off and got out of there. Then we took another hit on the boat deck. I was running right underneath there, going through the crew's quarters, and my arm was bleeding pretty bad. The electrician was coming through. He tied a tourniquet on my arm to stop the bleeding. I was burned, and my hair was burnt off. After that, we got underway. We took 5 more bomb hits and a torpedo head going out. Finally, we lost steering, and we beached her. She ran aground. After the attack was over, we took all the wounded to the hospital. Frederick Marin, 20 years old. On board the USS Vestal was 19-year-old Arthur Dallas Rogers of Summit Street. The Vestal was hit with 2 Japanese bombs and received additional damage from the force and heat of Arizona's explosion. Casting loose from the sunk and burning battleship at about 8:30 a.m., the Vestal moved up the harbor a short distance and anchored. Arthur Rogers would survive Pearl Harbor, but not the war. On September 17, 1943, he was on the USS Pompano, which was lost at sea. All the crewmen aboard were presumed lost.
22-year-old James Smith of Bolin Avenue was on the USS Ramsey.
We were tied to 3 other ships at the Pearl City landing. Things happened so fast, like 5 to 7 minutes. We lit all the burners and took off out of there. And the boilers held. James Smith, 22 years old.
21-year-old George Giorgetti of South 5th Street was aboard the USS Gamble.
The USS Gamble got underway and cleared the mooring buoy, but we were attacked by Japanese planes near the main channel entrance. We temporarily anchored astern of the USS Medusa for about 20 minutes before proceeding out of the channel. We cleared the channel entrance by 10:21 and commenced offshore anti-submarine patrol off the entrance Pearl Harbor. Giorgetti, 21 years old.
At the submarine base of Pearl Harbor were 20-year-old James Green of West Main Street and Richard Horchler of Flory Avenue. Throughout the attack, the officers and crew of the submarine base were in the thick of the fight. Those who were not manning guns were rushing ammunition to the gun crews, serving in the Navy Yard with firefighting details, or working with hospital and ambulance crews and rescue parties.
By 9:45 a.m. the attack was over, but no one knew that at the time. All 8 U.S. battleships were either sunk or damaged during the attack. 357 aircraft were either damaged or destroyed. The USS Oklahoma listed so badly it turned upside down. The USS Arizona exploded and sank when a bomb hit their forward magazine. On board and killed on the Arizona was Melvin Horn. He was the brother of Mrs. Pearl Nichols of Croton. Also on board and killed in the action, 1937 Newark High School graduate Murle "Slim" Davis. He was 21 years old and a radio operator on the Arizona in the Naval Reserves. He was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Ray Davis, 18 Forey Avenue, Newark. He had served for 4 years and would have been released from service the following April.
I wasn't scared a bit until it was over. I didn't have time to think. Afterwards, my knees shook a bit. I lost a lot of friends at Pearl, all on battleships. I was the only one from my platoon in boot camp not assigned to a battleship. Dexter Ford.
We spent the rest of the day ferrying officers to their boats and fishing guys out of the water. We didn't have time to think. We had a small boat and were able to get around the harbor. I was giving out personal belongings to help scared and wounded guys as they got out of the burning, oil-covered water. Many of the guys had been sleeping when the bombing started and didn't have proper clothing to go on shore. Fireman First Class, Lester Johnston.
About 2 p.m. we went down to the harbor to pick up the dead and bury them. One of our truck drivers went crazy and picked up an arm and began hitting people with it. I went for 3 days and nights without sleep and finally crawled under a barracks and collapsed. The nights that first week were terrible. We shot at every plane that came over, friend or foe, and at everything that moved. Robert Anderson.
Within a few hours, I was loaded on a truck and taken to Barber's Point. There I waited for 3 days for an invasion that never came. You can imagine, 6 gunners, scared to death. I remember the trees and the bushes, how the wind would blow them, and you can imagine what we were thinking. Sam Sawyer.
News of the attack finally reached the U.S. mainland. Jesse Peters was a radio technician in the U.S. Army Air Corps and was stationed at a base in Fresno, California, when Pearl Harbor was attacked.
Just hours after the bombing orders came, I and others at the base were handed broomsticks and baseball bats and told to beat to death the Japanese that were expected to immediately parachute in because no one but the military police had guns. For 2 weeks we patrolled the fields and the runway with nothing but sticks until an army detachment from a base in Sacramento arrived with rifles, pistols, and 2 jeeps. Jesse Peters.
Carl Strout of Croton was at a movie in Times Square.
I was 16 years old and had lied about my age to enlist. I had just completed basic training and was shipped to Fort Bennett Field in Brooklyn, New York. When I came out of the movie theater, a police officer motioned me over. He asked me if I knew what was going on. When I didn't, he told me the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor and I had to get back to my base. Carl Strout.
17-year-old Lloyd Phillips of Granville also was at a movie in Columbus, Ohio at the Palace Theater when Pearl Harbor was bombed.
It wasn't until we got out on the street after the movie that we heard the news. My first reaction was, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" I had no idea where it was. I was just a senior in high school. Lloyd Phillips.
In Newark, news of the attack came in the late afternoon.
I was told by my parents of the attack on Pearl Harbor. I asked them, "Where's Pearl Harbor?" I didn't know I'd find out firsthand in a couple of years. Jim Gerber.
I was ironing clothes when the news came over the radio. I was shocked. We weren't expecting it. Josephine Barrett Barron.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had killed 2,335 U.S. servicemen. 1,143 were wounded. 68 civilians were killed and 35 were wounded. The Japanese had lost 5 midget submarines, 29 aircraft, 64 killed, and 1 captured. President Roosevelt would address the country and the Congress on December 8.
Right after semester exams in January, I took a Greyhound bus to Columbus and then the Cleveland Avenue streetcar to Fort Hays. There was a crowd of young men at the main gate waiting to get in and join the Army. Some were too young to be signed up for the draft, so they wanted to enlist. Others were signed up for the draft, but they didn't want to wait for their number to come up. All that we talked about was getting in the Army and fighting the Japs. Paul Massa, 19 years old.
After the bombing, we weren't allowed many letters, and it was about 2 or 3 weeks before my parents and fiancé knew whether I was dead or alive. Robert Anderson.
One of the first letters to reach Newark after the attack was written by George Giorgetti on December 19, 1941.
Dear Mom and family, sorry I couldn't write sooner. I'm okay, don't worry. I won't be able to write so often because of sea duty. Tell Sister Coletta I said hello and Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all. Love, George Giorgetti.
Hawaii itself was now changed in the days and months after the bombings.
Shortly after the attack, the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in Honolulu closed its doors. However, the Navy ended up using the hotel as a rest and recreation center for enlisted sailors. It was a welcome diversion from what had happened. Charles Lingafelter.
Four years later, the war would be over. Pearl Harbor would become a sacred monument to those that lost their lives there. Years would pass, and the survivors of that day would reflect and remember.
I remember every day about Pearl Harbor. December 7th ain't any different. When you get my age, you can just be thankful for another day. War is hell. People forget unless you've been through it. You forget. I don't believe in war. There are no winners in war. I've seen so many dead soldiers on the beach, you could have walked on them and not got your feet wet. What did they die for? Just another island to build another airfield on. Sam Sawyer.
I think Japanese tourists should be barred from the Arizona and from the military cemetery. They caused it. William Brenner.
You stand over the grave of 1,200 men, and it does something to you. It's very sad. It's even sadder when Japanese tourists visit the site. I despised them then, and I despise them now because of Pearl Harbor and what they did during the war. We can never forget or forgive. The memory stays with you. It gives you a greater appreciation of life, and it brings home the old saying, man's inhumanity to man. in terms of what the enemy did to prisoners and wounded during the war. Sergeant John Hubert.